Well, we hope you enjoyed that session. In our next segment today, we're going to get into Zoom in just a minute. Our next segment today, we're going to introduce the Commissioner of Education here in the great state of education. His name is Frank Edelblut. I can see him on the line, and I'm going to embarrass him for just a minute. Let me just log in. Let me get my computer set up.
Frank, you can hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, you're no longer.
I'm going to embarrass you for a second. Let me tell you about Frank Edelblut. He started as a Commissioner of Education in New Hampshire. I did look him up on Wikipedia, so it's going to sound a little bit creepy. He started mid-February of 2017. Well, if you know FIRST Robotics, you know that the season doesn't start in mid-February. It starts actually in early February. I met Frank Edelblut actually 2 weeks before he was in his official capacity as the Commissioner of Education. I fell in love with him the moment I saw him, only because he was so fully embracing FIRST Robotics. He knew about FIRST before he became the commissioner, but as a commissioner, he's really seen this as a tool. And of course, Frank's not unfamiliar with politics. He represented a part of New Hampshire for many years. He served on a couple of committees, and he knows education. He has his undergraduate bachelor's degree in science. And then of all things, he went and got his master's degree in theology, which I always thought with Frank was just the coolest mix. So Frank, welcome, and I'm glad you're here. You know education, and I know something else about you too, which is that you are not unfamiliar to a whole education. You studied alternative education. You've explored it for a long, long time. And here we are in this really unfortunate scenario where we have so many of our students that are essentially homeschooled. So what is that skill set allowed you to bring to the table?
Well, thanks actually for letting me join you this morning. I'm excited to be here for the Governor's Cup. I wish that we would all be there in person, watching the robots racing around on the field right now, competing for that challenge. But I thank really FIRST for continuing to push this forward so that in the midst of all the disruptions that we've got going on here, that you guys are continuing to create opportunities for students in New Hampshire to be able to connect up to scholarship opportunities and to really craft a pathway. Maybe it is the runway to a bright future for one of our kids here and a number of our kids here in New Hampshire. So I'm really excited about that. And thanks so much for having me on. And I will, before I jump into your question, I want to just pause on one of the things that you said. It is true that I have some familiarity with FIRST Robotics. I refer to myself as a FIRST dad, which basically means that I've had the experience of trying to weld aluminum at 1 o'clock in the morning and watching it just disintegrate in front of me because it's really not that easy to do. But understand the challenges, but also understand really the incredible learning opportunities that FIRST provides to students, whether it's in New Hampshire or any place in the world that FIRST is engaging with, students and kids on a great basis. So incredible opportunity. And it is true. Something happened, right? Has anybody noticed that something's going on in the world these days?
Yeah.
Right. I think many of us still remember, I think it was March 15th, when we had to make a big pivot, both individually and in our families, but we had to make a pivot in our education system. We pivoted from a traditional in-person instructional model that had been in operation for 100, 150 years, depending on where you look. And everyone had gotten pretty accustomed to it, right? Talk about grooves. We had, worn a really deep groove in terms of how that system was working. And so we had to pivot. Here in New Hampshire, our educators did an awesome job in that pivot. They moved over to the remote instruction and support and really worked with kids to try and continue to find ways to have continuity of instruction, no matter what those circumstances are. And that same attitude prevails today, and that's continuing to drive what we're doing. But it's interesting, you pose that question. I've often been asked by folks about that, because I do have some experience with home education. And they're like, oh, this is just like home education. I'm like, not really. Right? There's a difference between home education and pandemic education. Those are not equivalents, and we want to make sure that we don't try and conflate the two of those things, because that is not the same thing. And they really, there's some stark differences between really the two of those. And I think it's important that we walk through those and we recognize them a little bit, because that's going to influence us in terms of how we really architect our instructional environments for pandemic, as well as, what are those instructional environments going to look like when we continue to move forward into the future? I mean, when you're dealing with, home education is a very, flexible system, lots of asynchronous types of learning opportunities. There's not this kind of sequential aspect to it of trying to go from this to this to this to this. When you're doing home education, if you get to a place and you have a student or a child in your home education program who has like an intense interest, as kids sometimes do, they get stuck on things. You can just say like, okay, fine, we're going to do robots for the next, month and a half. And maybe it's going to be all robots all the time, because then you can switch back over, and maybe, then the kid gets bored of one thing and they want to try something different. So then you're going to work on literature, you're going to work on, history or something like that. So it doesn't have kind of that sequential aspect of it. It can be very asynchronous.
Yes.
And what it really does then is it provides kids a lot of opportunities to explore and to figure out what they like, and to pause and to reflect and to just go deep on something that's of interest to the kids. One of the things that, and I talk fast, don't I?
No.
One of the things that
you're hitting
that
all the
we,
points that I was envisioning.
yeah, one of the things we know about kids is, and everybody knows this in education, like a kid's interest level in a subject drives their engagement and drives the depth of their learning, right? If a child is interested in something, they're going to go deep and they're going to learn all kinds of things about it. As I like to say to people, you can't stop a kid from learning if they want to know something about something.
That's
you know what I mean? Like it just happens, like you just got to let it go. So, and I guess the other thing that I'll talk about is really in home education versus pandemic education. And this is a good pivot to talk a little bit about pandemic education, but is the social aspect. In home education, there are incredible opportunities for socialization. The education, we talk about home education, and sometimes because of the name, I think people imagine that much of it takes place in the home, when in fact, much of it takes place outside of the home, in all of the great community resources that are in communities, whether those are, museums or parks or businesses that are often open to allowing students to come in and see what's going on there, reaching out to experts that are doing things, working in cooperatives where groups of, students who have similar interests are able to get together and explore areas together, almost like a first robotics team. So that social aspect is very important. And that's really one of the areas in pandemic education that we're really having to pay attention to, because the school environment provided for students a real opportunity to socialize with other children, right? It gave them that chance to connect with their peers, to just talk and find out what's going on. And we knew all along that that was a really important aspect of education, and the dynamic of growing up and maturing and becoming, a responsible adult in society. And so we've really had to be deliberate about being careful about that, to make sure we try to find out how can we continue to make sure that that happens. And for those children where it's not happening, to make sure that we have some safety nets in place, that nobody's falling through the cracks.
So
Go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, you're actually hitting many more points than I envisioned. And what really I didn't think about, but this hit me last night with Cambria, because Cambria is a homeschooled student, and her big plus, which I appreciate with all homeschooled students, is that she was given in her household the freedom to explore. And that is what you said. Like there's that plus that students have when they're learning at home. And of course, that's what we have now in pandemic education. So, but here's a question I have for you.
So hang on, let me just weigh in on that for 1 second, David. And here's sometimes the way I distinguish that. Sometimes people refer to home school instead of home education. I've always tried to be really deliberate about talking about home education as home school, because in pandemic, what we've really tried to do is we're trying to recreate school in the home, which basically means that you still don't have the flexibility. It's still sequential. It's still cohort driven and stuff like that. So what that's some of the learning that we can figure out is, how do we bust out of that?
So you're kind of getting to my next question, which is, with everything, every struggle, we have to find a way to make lemonade out of lemons.
Yes.
And certainly you've done that when you were a representative, writing bills and stuff. But we have this situation where students are home, and students might really, the structure is critically important for a young person. I agree with that. Do you think there's going to be any post-COVID life for these students where what we've all learned with their home education, do you think any of that's going to come back in the public schools? Do you think a student in a public school is going to have maybe more freedom to explore? Or do you think a post-COVID student is going to come back into the school with better technology skills? Like, what do you see with that post-COVID life?
So I actually think you've touched on a couple of really important points. So all of the educators that I talk to will tell you that, it's not going to go back to what it was necessarily, right? Like you don't, and we have to be careful because there's the temptation to kind of have this nostalgic perception of everything was perfect there. But we all were, before the pandemic, we were working to try and make advances and innovation in the education system. This, to your point, the lemonade that we're making is we're going to take advantage of these opportunities, these circums that we have. And I take advantage is maybe the wrong word, but it's helping to accelerate some of the stuff that we were already trying to advance, which is really recognizing the individuals in our learning system and individualizing that educational opportunity, so that we can kind of break away from that sequential learning, break away from that synchronous cohort model, and let kids have the opportunity to be able to do some exploration, to create some asynchronous aspect to it. Go ahead. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, so I was just going to touch up on that. I remember growing up, we never had I know that some kids could get a set curriculum from the school district and then still follow that, but just do it at home, versus my mother, she really set it up. When growing up, we had a family pass to the Museum of Science in Boston, and then we had like School of Rock, we had Magic School Bus, but things that I think kids really missed out on was the fact that we got to pick our projects based on what we were interested in. So I was really interested in like history and like earth and space science. So we got to pick projects that we would focus on for that week, focused around that. And I think that really helps with the individualization of a student and their interests instead of following a very set curriculum. Good. So I think that one of the advantages to pandemic home learning is that instead of consider saying, oh, it's just homeschooling, it's now we get to really personalize a student's learning and see where they can really excel and where they would maybe need more help.
So there's actually some education vernacular around that idea that you're exploring there. It's called agency. So in addition to allowing kids to go deeper because they're exploring areas that they're very interested in, they're building agency in a sense of they're responsible. It's kind of like self-directed education. And it doesn't mean that you don't make sure that they're learning all the important things, but it means that you don't have to break them up into 45-minute segments or 90-minute segments. Yeah. You can fit them in different ways. It's like a giant Tetris game, and we're just like spinning the pieces around a little bit differently in order to get them to land properly.
Commissioner, we're getting a little tight on time, but you spend a lot of your time, you do of course talk to students, but you spend most of your time talking to adults. You have a captive audience today. What do you want students in New Hampshire to hear from you in terms of how they should be handling COVID in the last couple of seconds that we have?
So I'm incredibly impressed by how well our educators and our students are handling the pandemic. I thank you for that. The one message that I will have two messages. One is, don't be shy about reaching out if you think you need to talk to somebody. Pick up the phone, email your teacher, email the department, connect to somebody. And the second is thank you first for creating great opportunities for students across New Hampshire.
That's well said. Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
I know you wanted to be with us today. You don't miss events. And what impresses me even more is that during this pandemic, And of course, your other things where your triathlons and your Nordic skiing that you do. I like to single you out. Today, you're coaching your kids' soccer team, of all things, getting that fresh air.
Yes,
so
we got
I
the
appreciate
U18
your time,
soccer
as always.
league. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank
Commissioner,
you.
you're the best. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon. Well, we hope you enjoyed that segment, that interview with our commissioner. We have our next workshop coming up, Track 1 and Track 2, that you're going to watch in our Zoom sessions. The first one is titled, Why Stay in New Hampshire for College? And that's put on by the University System of New Hampshire. Yeah, you're a perfect case for it. It's going to be moderated by Chris Mickus from BAE Systems. And of course, Track 2 today is the science of COVID with a focus on lungs. There's been a lot of new research studies that have talked about how your lungs or your breathing system is actually impacted by COVID. That's presented by Derek Morris. And then we'll see you back here shortly after that to talk about the Plymouth State University system, the First Center update. So we look forward to seeing you soon.
So one of the great resources at the community college level in New Hampshire is that there's pathways that they guide you to take certain classes at the community college level that will all transfer to the universities here in New Hampshire. So that way those classes do transfer over and you're covering not only your degree here, but the start of your degree at a four-year university.
The transfer process was actually a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. I mean, Northeastern accepted all of my credits except 2. But the transfer process for me was really easy. It was just a matter of sending my transcript, which I thought was amazing. Starting at a community college is a great alternative because it lessens the amount that you're paying literally in half, as opposed to if you're getting your bachelor's degree. It's essentially the same education that you're getting at the community college in those first 2 years as you would be getting at a 4-year university anywhere. Those first 2 years are just general education requirements, and my school proved that by accepting all of mine.